For Central and Eastern Europeans, the fact that Russia and China has an alliance is a huge obstacle. For China, the only thing which matters is the Chinese home development, the well-being of its economy. So when Viktor Orbán needs to extract some deals from Brussels, from Washington, from Berlin, then he goes to either Moscow or Beijing. He performs as a peacock.
Is China joining Russia in trying to blow up the European Union? German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is the latest European leader visiting China in a bid to reset a relationship that has come under stress over trade and Beijing's support for Russia's war on Ukraine. To discuss this, I'm going on the record with Ivana Karásková, a leading European expert on China at the Prague-based Association for International Affairs. She coordinates the China Observers in Central and Eastern Europe network. Ivana, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Adam, for having me. It's a pleasure.
So, it seems the European leaders are still hoping to separate the issue of trade, business, economic relations from the fact that China and Russia are geopolitical partners. Let's listen to Chancellor Merz in Beijing today.
I want as little trade protections and safeguarding as possible. We want trade that is as open, fair and free as possible. We want to continue to benefit from open markets and also enable stronger Chinese domestic demand, for example, through a moderate revaluation of your currency.
Is Europe blind to what is going on between China and Russia in terms of geopolitical partnership?
I don't think Europe is blind, Adam. I think that we do know exactly what is going on, but there is also this geopolitical reality which goes beyond Russia and China. So on one hand, we have the US over the past year in a bit of a turmoil, strengthening relationship with various countries, but in the same time also deappreciating relations with other countries and threatening the unity of the EU and threatening the part of Greenland being a part of Denmark. So on one hand, we have this also with the trade wars, and on the other hand, we have the reality of the war in our continent, started by Russia and supported by China. And we are looking at very dire consequences for our economy as well as unpreparedness in the military. So how I read those statements is basically that we are not naive, we are not blind, but we are trying to save us a little bit more time to remilitarize and in the same time trying to play this triangle between China, the EU and the US.
So, okay, let me ask this question from a different angle. Do China and Russia share similar objectives when it comes to the European Union?
Not necessarily. It looks very similar, but it's not the same. For Russia, the ideal outcome is complete disruption of the European Union, basically taking one country after another, also complete chaos and disruption of the NATO, which is the primary focus for Russians. For China, it's not necessarily the ideal outcome. China doesn't want to deal with Europe in chaos. It needs Europe as a market, and it hopes it will get it. So what China does is not attacking the EU as a whole. It doesn't, as I said, it doesn't want to see it completely disrupted. But what China is trying to do is to play one country against another, weaken the European Commission, and blend some of its narratives and objectives into the EU.
Right, but
in reality, you are absolutely right that for us, sitting in the EU, none of the actors is actually ideal to deal with.
Right. Well, some analysts and also domestic critics, Democrats in the United States, just this morning criticized President Trump for what they called trying to reach a grand bargain with both Russia and China, which leaves European allies at the mercy of what some analysts are calling the DragonBear. What's your take on this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that we are in a situation where we have one player, Donald Trump, who is completely difficult to predict, and he actually bases his pride and his self-esteem on not being predictable. So this is not going to change. It's not some kind of fault which he has and he wants to correct. So this is what we are actually looking at for the next 3 years at least. So yes, we have an actor which is difficult to predict, which is notorious in wanting to strike different deals. And that's what Europeans are very well aware of. So we are trying to hedge on one hand against this sometimes irrational, sometimes unpredictable leader of the US, and on the other hand, trying to strike some deal with China. But as I said, there is no naivety. This is basically just a geopolitical necessity.
Right. Well, Chancellor Merz is the latest European leader there. We spoke last week to President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, who put it this way, this dilemma of US, China, and how Europe should react. Let's listen for a moment.
People around the world, including Europe, will also be looking to hedge their bets elsewhere. Therefore, we do a trade agreement with Mercosur. Therefore, we do a trade agreement with India. And therefore, we'll probably at some stage open negotiations on an investment agreement with China. Not free trade yet.
What I'm worried about, or maybe I'm just overanalyzing it, but we just saw reports that China is helping Russia to build a factory in Belarus to produce drones. So, you know, this is a direct supply help to the Russian military waging war on Ukraine and possibly on the Baltic states. So my question to you is this, does that mean that this strategic relationship between Russia and China is being elevated to a new level where it's more industrial, more military?
It's a very good question, but I do not think that we are looking at something fundamentally different of what we have not seen over the past 4 years. So we do know that China and Russia struck this partnership without limits in 2022, just before the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. But there were traits and signs of ideological alignments of both Russia and China going as far as 2014 already. So this was not something which somehow miraculously appeared from out of nowhere. So we do see this kind of ideological alignment, which is based on the kind of the appreciation of current international order and thinking that what we used to have with one single actor, hegemon, the United States, is not benefiting both Russia and China, but there are other actors who are also disgruntled. So that basically aligns them. Where it comes to be dangerous is all the material consequences of this alignment. As you mentioned, the drone factory, but there are so many other ways how China is helping and giving the economic line to Russia to operate under the sanctions as well. So this has been going on for quite some time, and this is probably not going to stop because we are, as Europeans, not really putting our hearts and minds into stopping this alliance, into going after the Chinese companies, sanctioning quite heavily, and so on.
Velina Chakarova, like you, a geopolitical analyst, wrote yesterday that China and Russia's alignment is not a partnership of convenience. This is an operational military-industrial alliance which is wiring itself into the machinery of a hot war in Europe. What's your take on this?
I do agree with the first part, not necessarily with the second part. Not sure that China wants to have a hot military conflict in Europe. I do think that China is opportunistic. It wants to gain as much as possible from Russia. It wants to keep access to European Union. It wants to keep access to Ukraine. It wants to be somehow integrated into the reconstruction process if that ever begins. So my take on that is less sinister than Velina Chakarova's. That's here I do not think that Chinese activities are fully aligned, or the objectives for future of the European continent are fully aligned with Russians.
But you yourself mentioned that there are consequences of this. So if ideological alignment is one thing, Chinese priorities is another. But if you have practical developments such as building a drone factory with $400 million worth of equipment and engineering in Belarus on NATO's border, that can have very practical consequences if, let's say, Putin decides to escalate the war beyond Ukraine, let's say, to the Baltic states.
Adam, I think what you need to understand from the Chinese perspective is that these are all minor issues for China. For China, the only thing which matters is the Chinese home development, the well-being of its economy, and also the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and territorial integrity. These are the three main objectives. Not to say that China doesn't care about anything else, but that's the major existential thing for the Chinese foreign policy. On a lower pack is its competition with the United States. And China is interpreting everything in the world, all the development, through those lenses. Whether it hurts the United States, it's good. If the United States is engaged in skirmishes in Europe, great. If the United States is bleeding financially because it's moving its military towards Europe, great. So that's the only objective China is looking at. And the factory in Belarus is really a tiny detail in Chinese foreign policy, which China doesn't pay attention unless there are consequences. So if China feels that its reputational risk for its image as a peaceful country, as they want to promote itself in the UN, if China feels that there is economic risk, that there is a risk of sanctions, then it's the only threshold China is looking at.
So has there been any indication that European politicians are taking that geopolitical dimension seriously? Because all they talk about is trade imbalances. They're talking about unfair competition from Chinese companies. And I agree with you that for China, this is vital domestically, but it's becoming vital domestically also for European economies such as Germany, and by implication also Poland and Central Europe. But the geopolitical argument has been missing. At least I haven't heard any major political leader in Europe talking about this geopolitical dimension.
It may not happen very recently, but over the past 4 years, there were many discussions, both open discussions as well as closed-door discussions with the Chinese, that there are going to be dire consequences if China doesn't stop supporting Russia. So they are fully aware of this fact. And as a result of that, they also lost countries in Central and Eastern Europe, because Czech Republic, as well as Poland, as well as Baltic states, are fully aware of the geopolitical reality you just described. So it has consequences for China, but still, as I would say, the benefit for China is still outgrowing the loss it's currently taking. So there are politicians who are talking about this situation, but you may be right that there is a fatigue connected to Ukrainian war, and there is a fatigue of all the time advocating for Russia and China being the same kind of political actors and trying to prioritize here. So Russia is an existential threat, while China is kind of hiding behind Russia in this scenario. So to put it short, yes, there are political discussions. Yes, there are politicians who are fully aware of the current geopolitical situation and scenario, but it's probably not that visible as Russia and Ukrainian conflict per se.
Right. So, in other words, is China benefiting from the fact that the relationship between the US and Europe is so rocky, unpredictable, and fraught with different conflicts, be it trade, be it politics, be it Greenland? So does that provide China with extra leverage towards the Europeans?
Of course. it was already visible when Donald Trump started to threaten Europe with the trade war, that a political shift, at least in rhetorics in several countries, including Germany, was immediate. That you can see that this unwillingness of place Russia and China into the same basket of authoritarian malign regimes was the direct consequence of the recalibration of the relationship between the EU and the US. And China sees that. China knows that any kind of conflict or rift yields benefits for itself. And then it goes and talks with various countries, persuading them that it's not a malign power. It wants to have economic relationship. It's the champion of the export countries. It wants to uptake the current international order and so on. So in short, yes, China benefits quite a lot.
Right. And how do you perceive this plays out in the public opinion of Europe? You know, have the attitudes to China changed? In other words, I'm asking this because what is the room for maneuver for politicians in Europe to address this issue more forcefully?
Well, we are both sitting in Central Europe, which went through its own historical and contextual path with China. So we started, if you do recall, after 1989, we started as critiques of authoritarian regimes, wanted to have value-based foreign policy. Then the global financial crisis came, and suddenly everybody wanted to diversify, not only looking to the Western market, but also to start to looking into Eastern markets, such as post-Soviet space, Russia, China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on. So there is this kind of natural tendency to somehow hedge against development between the West and between the East. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the public bought into this kind of shift, suddenly being friendly with China. So when you look at opinion polls from 2012, specifically in Central and Eastern Europe, you would see that there is no liking for China. There is no growing appetite for the Chinese political regime or Communist Party of China. It basically stays the same. But the political narratives changed. They changed from value-based policy towards being less critical of China, wanting to have economic pragmatic relationship. And then after the COVID crisis, and also after the war in Ukraine, or the start of the war in Ukraine, then we are back towards being much more skeptical on Chinese. But there is really the difference between, let's say, political perceptions and narratives and how the population on the ground actually sees China. And we do not see a huge uptake of the population willing to support China and being in favor of what China actually stands for.
I just wanted to go back to what you just mentioned, which is that 10 years ago, China invested very heavily politically in Central and Eastern Europe. It created a special format. There was even some concern in Brussels that China is trying to drive a wedge between Central Europe, the new EU members from the East, and the western part of the continent. There was a lot of promise of investment, deals, export possibilities for Central and Eastern Europe. What is left of this?
I like how you said that China invested a lot politically. I think that's the key issue, because the political will was there from both sides, from Central and Eastern European side as well as from the Chinese side, because it was a natural development after the global financial crisis. We looked for other markets, but China equally looked for markets for its overproduction. So basically these two trends met, and suddenly everybody was interested in collaboration. But it didn't move from bombastic narratives and promises of investment towards some kind of material job creation and investment which would actually make sense. Plus, the countries benefited unequally. So there was investment into Hungary, investment in Serbia, a little bit in Czechia, a little bit in Poland, but all the other countries of the so-called 16+1, they didn't get even much. So that also backfired, and later on, with the change of international situation, led towards once again going back to the state as it was, being skeptical, on China. So China invested, yes, politically, economically less. Now it's coming back with some of its offers, but the international situation completely changed. And for Central and Eastern Europeans, the fact that Russia and China has an alliance is a huge obstacle in thinking, going back to, let's say, 10 years ago and having once again honeymoon with China. That's not possible anymore.
Right. Interesting that you mentioned Hungary, because it's yes, there has been considerable investment in Hungary from China, and Hungary welcomed that in a sort of political opposition to the EU and so on and so forth. But economically speaking, we've seen that actually in Hungary there's no growth. There are lots of scandals also surrounding some of these investments. So, and similarly in Serbia, the balance of these Chinese investments is not necessarily producing the effect. So again, you know, is this forcing a rethink in Beijing how to approach the region? Are they recalibrating their approach?
Not necessarily. So when the 16+1 format failed, China sent a number of delegations to Central and Eastern countries to analyze what actually happened. And then they came back and they agreed that, you know, 16+1 is a zombie. It's basically almost dead, in a clinical state of death. So what they started to do instead is to reach out to countries bilaterally once again. So we have this exercise of bilateral moves towards different countries. And Hungary and Serbia have been staunch allies of China in this respect, because they gained not necessarily the population, but the ruling elites gained something from cooperation with China. And on top of that, they perform something which we, with my colleagues, call Peacock diplomacy. So when Viktor Orban needs to extract some deals from Brussels, from Washington, from Berlin, then he goes to either Moscow or Beijing. He performs as a peacock, and then that scares everyone. And this multi-vector diplomacy yields benefit, because then Brussels is offering or Berlin is offering. So it's not necessarily just about China. It has more components. One is the domestic policy, that these leaders want to be seen as tough leaders who are not yielding to so-called Western pressure. And secondary, of course, it yields also benefits internationally, because some of the other countries do not want Russia and China to be more involved with the European countries, so they are starting to offer some alternatives.
So do you perceive China's current policy towards Central and Eastern Europe as continuation of trying to divide and rule and separate East from West and pick weak links in the European Union? Or has this shifted to more focus on Brussels and dealing with the big EU countries such as Germany and France?
I think it's all in one. In one sense, China is still focusing on so-called Daguo, the big powers, for which Germany basically as an engine of the EU, economic engine of the EU, is one of the top countries. But in the same time, with the system in the EU you can't omit even the smaller ones in case they start to make troubles, such as Lithuania, with opening the Taiwan representative office in Vilnius. So you have to basically, from the Chinese perspective, be present everywhere and try everything. But on the same time, what we do see with Chinese approach towards supranational institutions, such as European Commission, is that they also try to undermine the role of the European Commission. And as you said, rule and divide, basically build wedges between various countries, national state, as well as member states and the European Commission, which holds supreme power when it comes to economy.
Right. Well, finally, we're running out of time. So I wanted to ask you, there has been a lot of discussion about Chinese influence networks in Central and Eastern Europe. How serious is that? So soft power, agents of influence, if you will, how serious is that issue?
That's one of the things, Adam, which I think is hugely undervalued, not studied, not researched, and quite often omitted from the eyes of political stakeholders, because we quite necessarily, and for objective reasons, we focus on Russia. But China, despite being a newcomer to influence operations, is catching up really, really quickly. Plus, it has two things which Russia doesn't have. It has technology and it has money. So I'm really worried about the influence networks and about the fact that they are able to run almost undetected in some of the countries. Central and Eastern European countries have this historical advantage because we used to look at Russian disinformation operations and propaganda operations, plus we have a history of understanding how the propaganda actually works. So in this respect, I would even argue that Central and Eastern European countries are better positioned to analyze and to see, to detect Chinese propaganda and disinformation operations. But that being said, is still that we are not dealing with these enough.
Ivana Karásková, thank you very much for joining our program.
Thank you very much for having me.
This was all in On the Record today. See you next week.